Welcome to the Sikha this week on Project Lekutei Sichos. We're going to be learning Sikha Beis in Chelek Tazayin, Parshas Mishpatim, on page 251. So Sikha on the Rashi, one of the first Rashis in this week's Parsha. Funim Pasik Kisikna V'Gaimer. The Pasik Kisikna, which is the beginning of the halachas of an Eved Ivri, is Rashi Maitik Diverte Kisikna Eved Ivri. Und is mefarish, and Rashi explains what kind of an Eved are we talking about. Eved Shuhu Ivri. We're talking about a servant that's a Yid. Avdoi Shel Ivri, or maybe perhaps the meaning of Eved Ivri means an Eved that's serving an Ivri, which is an Eved Kanani, referring to a non-Jewish slave, Shelek Chasim Yisrael. And what it means when it says Eved Ivri, that it was acquired from a Yid. So Eved Ivri means that he was bought from a Yid. And regarding this Eved that was bought from a Yid, the Pasuk says that he serves only for 6 years. And when it says in the Pasuk that an Eved Kanani is someone that remains an Eved forever, and he's inherited by the next generation as well, that would be referring to an Eved Kanani that was acquired from a Goy. So there are two different kinds of Eved Kananis. An Eved that was bought from a Yid, and an Eved that was bought from a Goy. An Eved that's bought from a Yid serves only for 6 years, an Eved bought from a Goy serves forever. So that's B'Lokoch Min Anachri. Ava B'Lokoch Mi Yisrael Yetze B'Sheish. But if he was bought from another Yid, he serves for 6 years. Talmud Loim Avachulu. So Rashi brings a raya for the fact that this pasuk, when it says Eved Ivri, does not mean an Eved serving an Ivri, meaning an Eved Kanani, but it actually means an Eved Shahu Ivri, that this Eved is an Ivri. Darf man verstehen. So on this Rashi we have the following questions. Aleph, der Pirish is doch not of the Werter Eved Ivri. Rashi is explaining the meaning of Eved Ivri, whether it means an Eved which is an Ivri or an Eved serving an Ivri. Favos is Rashi maitik oich die Werter kisikna. So when Rashi explains this, why does he bring from the pasuk the two words of kisikna? You can't say, as Rashi is a maitik, the reason Rashi brings the two words of kisikna, to leave them, was von zeikem sich mistayeya sein, as da retzach wegen an Eved shuhu ivri. Because it's also from those two words, kisikna, that you can bring a proof, or you could at least have a partial proof to the fact that we're talking over here about an Eved that is an Ivri and not an Eved Kanani serving an Ivri. Rashi is mefarish weiter. In the next Rashi, on Kisikne, there Rashi says, as Kisikne muzich redden an oifen from machru bezdin. Kisikne means that he was sold by the bezdin. And Rashi there proves it, that the person, the Eved, that's sold on his own is already said elsewhere. Here when it says Kisikne, it's talking about a machru bezdin. Was das is shaykh, nor by an Eved Shuhu Ivri. A case of machru bezdin is only by an Eved Ivri. A bezdin would sell an Eved Ivri that stole, doesn't have what to pay, so then he gets sold by a bezdin. But that's not relevant at all by an Eved Kanani. So perhaps Rashi is bringing kisikne in his Dibur HaMaschel because it's also those two words that brings the proof that we're talking about an Eved Shuhu Ivri. So this can't be the case, says the Rebbe. Why not? Weil Aleph Oster hechrich von Rashi. So this proof of Rashi, as da retzach wegen machru bezdin, that because it says kisikne, we know it's talking about machru bezdin, is nit von die Werte kisikne. The proof is actually not from those two words of kisikne. Nor mitzad yitura dekra. The proof is from the fact, when it says over here kisikne, it can't be talking about an Eved that sold himself, because then it would be extra. There's another pasuk where it talks about a person that's poor and sells himself as an Eved. So the words kisikna itself don't prove anything. It's from the fact that it says in another place, so Rashi quoting the two words kisikna doesn't prove anything. And Beis, it goes even further, adarabba, the contrary. Oich oter hechrech. This proof, as machru bezdin, mitzad and pasuk v'chiyamuch, that we know that we're talking about a machru bezdin, and the proof is, because otherwise this pasuk is redundant, because it already says somewhere else that a person sells himself, is shayech, it's only a proof, dafke la'achar, mehotchen ha'hechacha from frier, as da retzach wegen evet shehu ivri, unit evet shal ivri. That's only a proof once we establish that kisikna evet ivri is actually talking about an evet which is an ivri. Then comes the question, if this pasuk is talking about an Eved, which is an Ivri, so then why does it speak about the same thing by the pasuk V'chiyamech achicha? It's redundant. And then we must conclude that here it's talking about a Machru Bezdin. So this whole conclusion that we're talking about a Machru Bezdin comes only after we establish that we're talking about an Eved Shehu Ivri, not the reverse, that because we know it's talking about a Machru Bezdin, therefore we could conclude that it's talking about an Eved Shehu Ivri and not an Eved Kanani. This is mashma oich from the Seder from the Pirushim and Rashi, as it's clear from also the way Rashi sets up his Pirushim, the order that he brings them. Was that is maktim dem Pirish, was is al kapanem beikir auf Evet Ivri, farem Pirish auf kisikne. First, Rashi explains the identity of who the Evet Ivri is, and only afterwards does Rashi discuss the word kisikne, that there's a redundancy that we already spoke about in Evet Ivri in another place. So it's clear that we don't first establish that we're talking about a Machru Bezdin. It's the other way around. We first establish we're talking about an Eved Ivri. And then Rashi comes and says, if so, it has to be talking about a Machru Bezdin and not an Eved Ivri that sold himself, because that already sells elsewhere. So we cannot answer that Kisikna that Rashi brings here is part of the proof to say that we're talking about an Eved Shehu Ivri. So why does Rashi bring those two words? Is another question there is, Wie kommt Gott a Havamine as the Teich von Eved Ivri is Avdoi Shel Ivri? How is there even such a thought to say that the meaning of Eved Ivri means an Eved serving an Ivri? L'chayre is mer poshit. Isn't it more simple as Eved Ivri meant Eved Shehu Ivri? An Eved Ivri, meaning he is an Ivri, he is a Yid. And as we find this in many places in Torah, and the Rebbe brings a few examples. By Nar Ivri, Vegin Yosefin, that he was a lad, an Ivri, it means that he was an Ivri. Ivri goes on the word Nar. And Nach, we find in a pasuk in Nach, Ulesheishon, Eved Mitzri, he had an Eved, which was a Mitzri. Was the Pirish is, as Erat Kahat, a Mitzri als an Eved. He had a Mitzri as an Eved, and not that the Eved was an Eved of a Mitzri. So that's the simple pshat of Eved Ivri. Eved Ivri means that he is an Ivri. So why does Rashi even entertain the possibility that Eved Ivri means an Eved of an Ivri? Is le'idach gisa muchach from Lashon HaKosov, and you find also when the Torah does want to tell you an Eved of somebody. So what does the Torah say there? Eved le'ish Amaleki. An Eved for an Ish Amaleki. As b'shas the pasuk made Avdoi Shel Amaleki, zokten it Eved Amaleki. Doesn't simply say Eved Amaleki, meaning the Eved of an Amaleki, nor Eved Li'ish Amaleki. So if the Torah here would mean to say an Eved of an Ivri, it wouldn't just say Eved Ivri. It would say Eved Li'ish Ivri. So it's pretty clear that Eved Ivri means an Eved Ivri, in the simple sense that he is an Ivri. Why is it necessary to Rashi to go to such a long arichis to prove this? So Mefarshim Zogin, so some of the Mefarshim say, as the Havamina, Avdoi Shel Ivri, the reason why there's a thought to say that Eved Ivri means an Eved of an Ivri is Mitzadem Dia Kaloshin Kisikne Eved Ivri. You're acquiring a slave. In other words, we're referring to him as a slave that even before you acquired him, he's already a slave. You're acquiring him as a slave. From Velachis is mashma, and from that it seems, as a koif taza was a shoin an Eved Friya. You're buying an individual that's already a slave. So therefore it's more logical to say that it means an Eved of an Ivri, and you're buying this Eved that was serving another Ivri. He was already an Eved when you bought him. So that's the diak of Rashi, the word Eved. Das is aber nicht maspek. However, says the Rebbe, this proof is not strong enough. Warum? Oib von dem Lashon HaKosov, vom Shute shel Mikra, is mer mashmas as retzach wegen avde shel Ivri. If in fact the simple meaning of Eved Ivri, because it says that you're acquiring him as an Eved, so it means that he was an Eved before serving another Ivri. Hot Rashi dermit gedaft an eben sein Pirish. So Rashi should have immediately began with this pshat. Al derech dugme, Yochel avdoi shel Ivri. And Rashi should have immediately said, Yochel avdoi shel Ivri, that I would think, because of the simple meaning of the words, Kisikna Eved Ivri, that it means that you acquired someone that's already an Eved, and he's an Eved serving an Ivri. Rashi should have began with this right away. Und denachas shaylo zayin, and then Rashi would negate this and say, no, this is not the correct pshat. Talmud loima, ahechdech as das meint, Eved shehu Ivri, to prove that Eved Ivri means that the Eved himself is actually an Ivri. So why wouldn't Rashi begin immediately with this pshat, saying right away, Eved, you bought him as an Eved Ivri? So that means that he was an Eved right when you bought him. Von dem was Rashi hoip gleichon. So how does this Rashi work here? How does it start? Rashi starts with Eved Shehu Ivri. When it says in the Torah, Yisikna Eved Ivri, it means that the Eved is an Ivri. And then Rashi says, Oy Einoi. No, maybe not. Maybe it means Eved Shehu Ivri. And then Rashi disproves that and comes back to his initial statement that it's an Eved Ivri. Why does Rashi write it in this way? Is mochach, so it's clear, as das is the erste svare vitzitaichen dem pasik. That's actually the most logical and initial way that Rashi starts with to explain the pasik. Und erst noch verta safik oy eine ela avde shalivri. And only afterwards does Rashi bring up a possibility that maybe Eved Ivri means an Eved of an Ivri. But the simple pshat of the words Eved Ivri, like the Rebbe pointed out before, is that the Eved is an Ivri. So our question remains, so why are we even bringing up the possibility that it means an Eved Shehu Ivri? And Rashi goes back and forth. He starts off with the simple pshat. Rashi himself, by starting off with that, makes it clear that that is the simple pshat, an Eved which is an Ivri. Then Rashi says, no, maybe not. And then he comes back and brings a proof to that. Why does Rashi have to go through all of this? Gimel, the third question here is, Favos daf Rashi bavaran min do. Why is Rashi here answering umani mekayim visnachalte moisam? That if over here it means an Eved of an Ivri and he's an Eved Kanani, and the pasuk says he only works for 6 years, so Rashi explains, so then what would I do with a pasuk that it says later in Parshas Bahar visnachalte moisam that an Eved Kanani is actually an Eved forever? Why is Rashi answering that question here? Die kushya vet erst werden as me vet kommen zu dem pasuk karev l'soif sefer vayikra. That's a question that comes up only much later when you'll come there in Parshas Bahar in the end of Sefer Vayikra. So there you have to answer such a question. If in fact over here Eved Ivri means an Eved Kanani, why does Rashi answer that question here? Und Chach, der Mokke von dem ganzen Pirish Rashi is von Mechilte. This entire Rashi is a quote from the Mechilte. Is the Chidua kemeduba kamepamim. It's known as it's been spoken many times. As als was Rashi schreibt the Pirushi ala Teire is mochrach from Pashtus Aksuvim. Everything Rashi brings is understood and proven from the simple pshat and the pasuk al asar, right over here. Oder zusammen mit dem was mat gelernt frier, or based on something that we learned before the pasuk you're learning now. And over here, our question is, why is Rashi addressing something that only comes up later in the end of Chumash Vayikra? Ubefrat, as benidden die don, the montnit Rashi as the Mokafas and Pirish is from Mechilte. Rashi is quoting the Mechilte, but does not mention the fact that he took it from the Mechilte, like he does sometimes. So the fun is verstandig, as the ganze Pirish, everything that he's bringing from the Mechilte, is Mochrach al pi pshutei shal mikra do. There's a raya. Everything Rashi is saying is relevant for the understanding of the Pashut, the Pshat of the Pasuk, right over here. So, the Rebbe's question over here on this Rashi is, why is Rashi even grappling with this translation, Eved Ivri? It seems to be a very simple, straightforward translation, an Eved, which is an Ivri, and yet Rashi is quoting a Mechilte that entertains the possibility that it means an Eved Shel Ivri, that an Eved that serves an Ivri. Why is Rashi even bringing that up? And Rashi goes even to the length to explain a pasuk in end of Chumash Vayikra, which is totally irrelevant for the pasuk here. So the explanation of this Rashi is as follows. Steht für ihr im pasuk. The pasuk earlier tells us about the Yidden when they came out of Mitzrayim. As by Yitzias Mitzrayim, haben Yidden mitgenommen from Mitzrayim, asach, kli kesef, kli zav, v'chulu. They brought along with them a lot of gold and silver. Danach is by ze zugekommen, noch mehr kesef v'zav, and bizes hayam. They even got even more gold and silver by the Yamsuf, after it spit out all the gold and silver from the Mitzrayim. Wie Rashi sagt, vayasa Moshe noch kriyas Yamsuf. As Rashi there says, when it says that Moshe Rabbeinu had to pull the Yidden away from the Yamsuf, he siyam bal karcham, against their will, he took them away from there. She'otru Mitzrayim susayim betachshite zav v'kesev avonim tovis. The Mitzrayim adorned their horses with gold, silver, and jewelry. V'ha Yisrael meitzinaisam beyam, and the Yidden were finding them at the side of the Yam. And the gold and silver that they got at that point was even greater and more than what they took out of Mitzrayim. So what do we see from all of this? Das heißt, as bei alle Yidden is mekoyim geworden die Avtache, as wollen haben a Rechush Gadol. By all Yidden, the promise to Avraham Avinu was fulfilled, that the Yidden all came out extremely rich from all the gold and silver. From them is moving with Pashtos. So if so, it's simply understood as in a matzah von Azag Reisa Shirus by Yidden, when Yidden are so rich, is damot given Shaykh HaMetzias as a Yid Zolver and a Neved. So it's not something which is at all possible that a Yid should be sold as an Eved for any reason. Was das kommt mach masanias und chayse mamin, which only happens when a person is poor and he sells himself as an Eved, or if he steals and he has to be sold as an Eved because he doesn't have what to pay. So even if there was a Yid that stole in that time period, but he definitely had what to pay up, they were so rich, so there would be no reason for a Yid to be sold as an Eved. As the parsha Ve'ela Mishpatim kommt gleich nach Matan Torah. This is the first parsha that comes immediately after Matan Torah. As man kotzer noch Yitzias Mitzrayim v'Kriyas Yamsov, just a short time after Yidden leave Mitzrayim and after Kriyas Yamsov is mistaver. So isn't it logical as l'chol l'roish? First and foremost hat der Eibishter angesagt Yidden die Mishpatim v'tzivuyim auf Sachen was eine Negeya gewenne Negeya und Motzoi gleich beim Yenim Zman HaMatzav. That the Eibishter, now he gave the Yidden the Torah, so what's the first thing that the Eibishter should speak about to the Yidden? Something that's relevant. The new Torah that he gave them, the Eibishter should speak to them, the halachas and the mitzvahs that's relevant for them, right then. And like you see that the Eibishter actually did in the end of Parashas Yisro. Like what it says there, Lo yisasen itchi elekei kesef, elekei zav goyme, do not make for me idols of silver or gold. Mizbeach Adama Goyme, the Mizbeach should be made out of earth. Mizbeach Avanim Tasli, a Mizbeach of stones. Unit, or the Lav Dafke, Mizbeach Kesef Ezav, and not a Mizbeach that would necessarily have to be made from silver or gold. Chach, and why is this one of the mitzvahs that's brought up right after Matan Torah? Chach, Yederef and Zeyat Kahat, Aribui Kesef Ezav. They had enough gold and silver to build a Eibishter, a beautiful gold or silver mizbeach. So therefore this is a mitzvah that's relevant right then to tell the Yidden, don't use your gold and silver to build me a mizbeach. So that, as we see, so the Eibishter is giving them a mitzvah or speaking to them about something which is important right then. So now the question comes, so how about here? Ve'ela Mishpatim, one of the first mitzvahs right after Matan Torah. The Ribber, so now, noch dem Rashi is maitik evet shehu ivri. After Rashi lets you know that when you read the words evet ivri in the pasuk, what's the simple translation of evet ivri? An evet which is an ivri. As their lashon evet ivri meint bepashtos evet shehu ivri. That's the meaning of those words. Muzman abba bavaranin. However, Rashi has to clarify, oy einoi elo avdoi shel ivri. Maybe in fact we should say that we're talking about an evet kanani that's serving an ivri. And why is this? Mitzad dem hemshech v'seider aksuvim. Because of the continuation and the place where this mitzvah is said is the svara mechayev. So it's logical to say as the retzach wegen avdoi shel ivri. A guy, an Evet Kanani that's serving an Ivri. Evet Kanani shalakhasim Yisrael, an Evet Kanani that you acquired from another Yid. Wie bald as Yidden jeder Ivri otan bald noch bizes Mitzrayim und bizes Ayam Kanal gehat Rechush Gadol. Because as we pointed out before, all Yidden were very rich at that time. Gehat euch avadam u'shvachis. And therefore, besides the fact that what the Rebbe said before, there was no Yid that had to be sold as an Eved. So it's not logical to say that suddenly now we're speaking about an Eved Ivri, but it's also logical to say that Yidden had Rechush Gadol, including Avadim and Shvachis. They made sure to have as much servants as they needed, as they wanted, in order to be able to serve them. And they used this money, as the Rebbe here points out in the Ha'ara, they bought from the merchants of Goyim around them, or they... however they got the servants, Evet Kananim. But if they were so rich, they definitely had maidservants and then other slaves that helped them, that served them. So that's something that would be very relevant to speak to them right here. Wie es ist gesagt geworden Lufneze bei der Aseres Adibris, and you actually see that in the Aseres Adibris itself, the Eibusha speaks about the slaves that the Yidden own, Avdocha va'amascha, your slaves and your maids. So, true Eved Ivri in the simple translation means an Eved which is an Ivri. However, looking at the place where this mitzvah comes, it's not logical to say that the first mitzvah the Eibusha speaks about is an Eved, which is an Ivri. Which Yid became an Eved at that point? Rather, it is logical to say that the Yidden were very rich, and they had servants, maids, and therefore the Torah is telling me the halachis of an Eved Kanani that they had at that point. So by ben chamish lemikra ken sich bestellen die Shaila. But now, if we're going to in fact say that we're talking about an Evet Kanani, which is more logical because of the time period and the Yidden situation, but then another question would come up. Mat gelernt frier. The child already had learned earlier, as Avram Avinu had gehat an Evet. Avram Avinu also owned a slave, Eliezer, von nach vader Bris ben Absarim, and he was his Evet from before the time of Bris ben Absarim, und is geblieben Evet Avram echt zendliche Jahren später, and he remained to be Avram Avinu's slave tens of years later. Wie se wird erzählt bei sein Schliches zum Mishadach sein Yitzchak Avinu. He was the Shliach sent to make the Shidduch for Yitzchak. That's many, many years later. Und wie bald, Avram hat mit keinem gewinnt, kolatere kulat shalei nitno, wie Rashi hat schon früher mefarisch gewinnt. So Rashi already told us that Avram fulfilled all of Torah even before it was given. Is wie kommt es, als Avram hat gehalten an Evet Kanani, Eliezer, a so viel Jahren? So how is it possible that Avram Avinu kept Eliezer for so many years? Und hat nicht mekayim gewinnt dem Tzivi ha-Teire da, and he did not fulfill what the Teire here says, as shei shonim yavud uvashvis yetzalach avshichinam, that at the 7th year he goes out free. Oi, das meint, avdei shel ivri. If we're going to say, like it would seem from the context and the place where this pasuk comes in, that we're in fact talking about an Evet Kanani, and the Torah is saying regarding an Evet Kanani that he only works for 6 years and then the 7th year he goes out free, so the question becomes, what's with Avram Avinu that fulfilled all the Torah? How did he keep Eliezer for all these years? And he didn't go out free after 6 years. The Riber muss Rashi bavaran in Bepasha Seinu Otarinyan. So as soon as Rashi suggests that maybe we're talking about an Evet Kanani, so right here Rashi has to address this. Nor, however, how does Rashi address this? Anstatt die Tmir von Hagas Avram, instead of Rashi bringing this question regarding Avram's conduct, bringt dieselbe Stire no beyesa teikif. So Rashi chooses to bring this question, but he brings it from another source that makes the question even stronger. From pasuk und mitzvah mefareshes b'Torah, where there's a clear mitzvah in the Torah regarding an Evet Kanani, ma ani mekayim v'snachalta ma'isa. The pasuk clearly says that an Evet Kanani is to be kept and it works forever. But when Rashi brings up that question from Visnachalta Ma'isam, he's not coming to address the contradiction from a pasuk in Parshas Bahar. Because the Ben Chamish Lemikra reading the Parsha here doesn't have that question. He's really answering the question that the Ben Chamish Lemikra has from Eliezer Eved Avram. How did Avram keep Eliezer for such a long period of time? Rashi is addressing it by bringing up this question in a stronger form by showing you that the Torah itself says that this is the mitzvah, to work with an Evet Kanani forever. So therefore we have a contradiction over here. Und verempfert, and Rashi says, that there's a difference who the Evet was bought from. If he was bought from another guy, Avram bought Eliezer from a Nachri, so in such a case he's supposed to work with him forever. Masha Enkein, which is not the case when it comes to an Evet that's brought from another Yid. On this, the Torah says over here, only 6 years, and not any longer. So we understand why Rashi entertains the idea that Eved Ivri means an Eved working for an Ivri. Because this is what makes more sense to say the Pasuk is speaking about at this time in history, right after Yetzias Mitzrayim and right after Matan Torah. Api an alles verstandig, was Rashi bringt vom Pasuk, euch die Werte kisikne. This explains why Rashi also quotes the 2 words of kisikne. Well, das is mechazik the pirish, as es meint, Evet shehu ivri. Those 2 words strengthens Rashi's conclusion that we're not talking about an Eved Kanani that's working for an Ivri, but we're in fact talking about an Eved which is an Ivri. Warum? L'chayre is the akdamas hakosef kisikne ibirik. Those 2 words kisikne are actually extra. Had gekent mit an etzem din. The pasuk could have immediately began with the actual din that it wants to say. Eved ivri shei shonim yavid goyim. It's not telling you any halacha about how to buy him and about buying him. It's talking about how long he stays as an eved. So it could immediately say Eved ivri shei shonim yavid. Wie mir gefindt bekamen mekaymes b'Torah, as we find in many places in Torah similar. Al derech b'Parsha Seinu, like it says in this week's parsha as well. Make ish v'meis goyim. So here as well, why doesn't the Torah just tell you the halacha it wants to say about the Evet without giving the introduction ki sikna, if it'll happen that you'll buy an Evet? The lashon ki sikna, when it says ki sikna, if you will buy, main tapu'ule ba'asid. What is that emphasizing? We're talking about something that could happen in the future. Aber b'hoive is noch di pu'ule nita, but in the present, this is not yet here. And it's even more so over here, as we pointed out before, having an Eved Ivri in this time period after Yetzias Mitzrayim is really not at all possible. The Yidden were rich enough, and there was no scenario of an Eved Ivri. So when it says Ki Sikna, the Torah is emphasizing that having an Eved Ivri is something that will happen in the future, but it's not really something that's relevant now. Meile is von dem Mochach, the fact that the Torah adds those two words, ki sikneh, emphasizing that we're speaking about something that could happen in a future time in history, as da retzach wegen dem knie von an Eved shehu ivri. We're talking about acquiring an Eved which is an Ivri. Was behoive demult is a snit shayach. At that time period it wasn't possible. Und nit wegen an Evet Kanani, and we're not speaking about an Evet Kanani, Avde Shalivri, an Evet serving an Ivri. Hayesas legabi im, past nit, und is ibidik der kisikne. If we would be speaking about an Evet Kanani, why would the Torah be saying kisikne, that this is only something for the future? Val mitzad roi vashram, on the contrary, if they were so rich, haben Eden demelt sicher gehat avodim Kananim. So we definitely could assume that they did have avodim Kananim presently, right then. So why would the Torah write kisikne? Upshita, as we cannot sagen, as es nit kein dava hoive v'ragel. We definitely cannot say that at that time period it was not common for a Yid to have an Evet Kanani. It probably was common. They were all very rich, and they probably had maids and slaves to serve them. So therefore, the term kisikne is part of the proof to say that we're talking about something later in history, in the future, not in this time period, because that now there was no Eved Ivri. That's why Rashi brings the two words of kisikne in the Dibur HaMaschel. However, the question still remains with what we started off with. Favos take hyped on the Torah the dinim from Mishpatim. Take if la'acha matan Torah mit dem din Eved Ivri. Why, in fact, does the Torah immediately after matan Torah begin with this halacha about an Eved Ivri? Was is demelt gewen am milsel leishchiche klal, something which was not at all common, or nit mit adova aragov ha'hoive. And why doesn't the Torah begin with a mitzvah, with a halacha, which is common, which is presently relevant? Ubefrat noch as kisikne Eved Ivri, and especially this scenario of buying this Eved Ivri in this parsha is a teitzah von a friedige pe'ula von gneve. We're talking about something that happened as a result of this person stealing. Parveliche er is mechuyev zu zollen, and he was obligated to pay. Chamisha, or the arba, or the shnayim. Sometimes you have to pay 5 times as much as a penalty, sometimes 4, or twice as much, as the parsha here later says. If he has no money to pay, so then he's sold into slavery. Hat doch die Teile lechayre zum Ersten gedacht ansagen die friedige Dinim von Chiyuv Tashlume kama pamim kacha hey v'dale der Shnayim. So why doesn't the Torah start the story from the beginning? Why doesn't the Torah begin to tell you what happened here? This person stole, and you're not allowed to steal. And then he's obligated to pay. How much is he obligated to pay? And then if he can't pay, so then he's sold as an Eved. So we have 2 questions here. First of all, why is this the mitzvah right after Matan Torah if it's not relevant for this time period? The Eibush is telling us a mitzvah ki sikna, only for the future. And besides that, even looking at this mitzvah in itself, Eved Ivri is sort of the end of a story that began with Gneva, and then not being able to pay for that Gneva. So why didn't the Torah start from the beginning? Why is this Eved Ivri the first thing that the Torah speaks about? Since this is a simple question in the Pshat of the Pasuk, is nit muvam favos Rashi was is mefarish alle kushis b'pshuta shel mikra ve'enfetas nit b'pirusha. So Rashi, which answers all questions, why does Rashi not answer this question? We find other Mefarshim, the Even Ezra, the Ramban, the Barbanel, and so on. They do answer this. Why is this mitzvah serious? Hagam zeire pirushim zene nit in ganzen al derech hapshat vi pirush Rashi. Their pshat is not exactly addressing every question that comes up in the simple reading of the pasuk. Rashi does, so certainly Rashi should address this. Maybe you'll argue and say, this is not a kind of a question that Rashi addresses. This is not a question you could ask in the simple pshat of a pasuk. In the pshat of the pasuk, there isn't necessarily an explanation for the place where the Torah decides to put the mitzvahs, the time period. Where the Eibush says the mitzvahs doesn't necessarily have to have an adequate explanation according to the Pshuta Shel Mikra. So we can't say that here. Varom, since neisef of them was bereish parsha seinu gufe. Right here in the beginning of this week's parsha is Rashi madgish ve'ela meisef al rishayim. That when the Torah says ve'ela, the Torah is now saying the Mishpatim. It's adding, it's coming as a continuation to before ma rishayim misinai. Just like before, the Aseres HaDibros were given from the Eibishter on Sinai, afelu misinai, and so too this is misinai. And then Rashi goes on to say v'lama nismecha. Rashi does address why this comes right here, right after Aseres HaDibros. So we see that Rashi in Pshutei Shel Mikra is addressing the smichus of why it says right after the Matan Torah, these mitzvahs. Pianal, but besides this, according to what we said before, is doch das shenismecha lematziv de bizas mitzrayim v'hayam. The problem over here with the fact that this mitzvah is said right here and now, not long after the Yidden got all this riches from the Yam and from Mitzrayim, the Svara from Kasol Kedaitach in them Pirish Rashi as their pasuk retnet wegen Evet Ivri, no wegen Evet Kanani. The fact that this is the time period that it was said is the reason why Rashi entertained the idea that we are actually talking about an Evet Kanani. So we see that in Pshutei Shel Mikra, Rashi is definitely taking into account the smichas of the time period when it was said. That's something that does have to be addressed. This itself is the pshat in our Rashi, why we are saying, or we had the idea to say, that we're talking about an Evet Kanani. So if so, we should address the question, according to the conclusion that we're talking about an Evet Ivri, why in fact did the Torah choose to say the halacha of Evet Ivri now, right after Matan Torah, in a time period when this halacha is completely irrelevant? V'oid v'ikket, another very important point. Da ken doch net sein ki sitne Evet Ivri Edem and Paskind, dem din v'nimka b'gnevasi. As the Rebbe pointed out, there's another question here really. Forget about the fact that we have a question of how is this connected to Matan Torah and how is this connected to this time period. Besides that, the Torah is giving us a mitzvah talking about the Evet being sold by a Bezdin, which is at the end of a whole story. Why didn't the Torah begin with the Gneva and with the halachas of payment for Gneva and then with the fact that he can't pay? So the Torah choosing to talk specifically about an Evet Ivri right over here, right after Matan Torah, the end of a whole story of a mitzvah seems to be totally out of place. How do we address this question? Rashi doesn't seem to address this. Yesh loymar, so we can say, as Rashi hat das bavarin mit sein Pirish and Hemshech Parsha Seinu. Rashi does clarify the reason for this with something that he says later in the Parsha. And there Rashi says as follows: when it comes to the Eved that wants to remain on further after 6 years, so there's a mitzvah of drilling a hole through his ear. And the reason is, Ma ra eisen lehirotza. What's the reason why we drill a hole in his ear? We call Sharei Vadim when we choose the ear from all other limbs in the body, Shebeguf. Omer Rabbi Yechanan ben Zakkai. So Rabbi Yechanan ben Zakkai explained, it's this ear that heard the Eibush saying at Har Sinai, do not steal. And he went and he did steal. Teiratza should be drilled a hole into it to remind it that the ear should have listened. And when we speak about an Eved that sold himself into slavery, so why is the ear being drilled? Oizen, Sheshamal Har Sinai, the ear that heard the Eibush saying, Kili b'nei Yisrael avadim. My children, the Yidden, are my servants. V'holach v'kana adon la'atzmai. And he went and he acquires an Evet for himself. Teratza should also be drilled, his ear should be drilled. So we see right over here that Rashi is telling us that regarding this Evet, there is a specific inyan that connects it directly to Har Sinai, as the Rebbe will now explain. So the explanation of what's unique about this mitzvah of Evet Ivri that I see here, bei anderen Mitzvahs gefindt man nicht, als die Teire soll madgish sein, die Scheiches von dem Schar Mitzvah zu der Mitzvah. When it comes to other mitzvahs, we don't find the Teire emphasizing, clearly explaining what exactly is the connection of the reward of a mitzvah to the mitzvah itself. There are many mitzvahs that the Teire doesn't say a reward at all, what the reward is. Even those mitzvahs that the Teire does say the reward, it does not explain in the Teire the connection of the reward to the mitzvah. Ubedogme, for example, the mitzvah from Kibbud Aveim, Vasir Schar is Laman Yerichin Yamecha Geimer, honoring your parents will give you long life, is Neisef of them, was the Schar is nit Nicke bald noch der mitzvah. This is a kind of reward which is not recognized right after you fulfill the mitzvah. It's only recognized after a long period of time. Is in the mehus haschar nit kentik the shayches to the mitzvah dafke. The schar of long life, you don't see necessarily what is the connection to the mitzvah of kibbud avein. Val derech ze similar by einshim efavedis when it comes to the different punishments. Zet minit in dem einish malkis or the kares v'chayetze b'zeh, the usual einshim that the Torah speaks about, abazundere shayches to di avedis. You don't see the specific connection that there is to this aveda. V'zene mechayev the einshim, that you're obligated, that you get these punishments for them. That's when it comes to all mitzvahs or avedis. Here, what's unique about an Eved Ivri is Fabint the Torah dem einish mit sein sibbe. Here the Torah explains how the punishment is connected and is caused by the Aveda itself. Verotza es oznoi, you drill a hole in the ear. Kum tefar vas oizen shesham al Har Sinai, because this is a mitzvah that this ear heard on Har Sinai. Whether it's leisignov or kalibin Yisrael avodim. So here the Torah is showing you that it's an einish that is fitting and as a result of what the Aveda itself was. Now, the Rebbe clarifies, as the chiyuv from veratza adayna fesaznai, when do you drill a hole in the ear of an Eved, kommt nit bald by the peulis for some göring event zu sein an Eved Ivri. You don't do this as soon as the Aveda of being an Eved Ivri happened. You don't do it as soon as he steals. You don't do it as soon as he sells himself into slavery. Nor erst nachdem vi oma yoima eved ahaftis adayni esishti vesbane layetze chafshi. Only after 6 years, and he says, I love my master, I love my wife that I married here, and my children here, and therefore I refuse to go out free. It's only at that point that you drill his ear. Is es aber doch nit kein einish de far, was hat gesagt hafti geimer. However, as Rashi points out, the drilling of the ear is not coming as a punishment for the fact that he wants to remain in slavery, the fact that he says he loves his master. Nor the far, it's really a punishment for what happened before. Was oizen shesham al Har Sinai lisigna v'holach v'ganav. As Rashi clearly says, it's drilling the ear because he didn't listen to a signal that was said at Har Sinai. Or he didn't listen to what it was said that he shouldn't have sold himself into slavery. So it's that which really is the cause for his ear to be drilled, because either he stole that is, or he sold himself into slavery. So it's related to that, and not to the ahaftes adonias ishtes bane. However, we do wait until later to drill his ear, as the Rabbi explains in a different sikha, which we learned a year ago in Chelek Yud Aleph, that we only wait to see that he's actually persistent in this aveda, and it didn't come just from a difficult situation that he was in. But once he persists in this aveda, we see that he was over the geneva, and it was done willingly, and he sold himself into slavery, and he wants to remain into slavery. So the drilling of the ear is either because of Geneva or because he sold himself into slavery. And it's related to what he heard at Har Sinai. So here we could see that this mitzvah of Eved Ivri is uniquely related to Har Sinai. Damit is Mavuer, was kisikne Eved Ivri Geimer, is der erste von den Mishpatim, was die Torah sagt dann, take of Lachamaten Torah Bar Sinai. So with this we understand why this is the first mitzvah that the Torah says right after Matan Torah on Har Sinai. By an Eved Ivri Zetzechon, when it comes to an Eved Ivri, you can clearly see in Zain Einish, when it comes to the punishment of an Eved Ivri that wants to remain an Eved Ivri, Ba'oifen Goli v'Nikir, in a very clear, recognized way, Oich in Zain Guf Hagashmi, and it's noticeable even in this Einish that's done in his physical body, der Verbund von Zain Mishpat mit Har Sinai, the connection of his Mishpat to Har Sinai. By all mitzvahs, there isn't even necessarily an explanation that the Torah tells us regarding the schar or the einish. Here there is. And what is that hesber? That it's directly related to Har Sinai. So therefore, this is a mitzvah that expresses a connection, a clear and direct connection to Har Sinai. That's why it comes right over here. So based on this is a chiddush ikri in the dinim von Eved Ivri. We see a very important and a powerful chiddush that you find only by an Eved Ivri. Der nit ontfolgen von dem Ansag bei Har Sinai. What is the Aveda really about? When a person sells himself into slavery, or he steals and he gets sold into slavery, what's really the Aveda, the essence of what this Aveda is about is the fact that he didn't listen to what was said to him by Har Sinai. When the Eibusha said, Lei Signoiv and Kelibnei Yisrael Avodim. By all other Avedas, so it's an Aveda, that he was even on a particular Aveda that he did. These two Avedas, we see in the Einish that the Torah is emphasizing that the issue here is that you didn't listen to Matan Torah. You didn't listen to what the Eibusha said at Har Sinai. That's what's unique about this Aveda here, this Inyan of Eved Ivri. Und der Einloi v'nimkar mitzad dem Geudel HaTashlumen, and when it says that he doesn't have what to pay, and then the payment is too high and he can't pay up the geneva that he stole, is a sibbe chitzainis. That's just the external cause that brings it to this situation. So the Torah doesn't bother telling you the whole history and the beginning of the story of how it comes to it that this person gets sold into slavery, because that's not the main point there. The Torah is trying to point out that here, by an Eved Ivri, when the Torah says you drill a hole in his ear, from this I see that Eved Ivri is a kind of mitzvah, or actually an Aveda, that expresses something that the person didn't listen to what the Eibusha says as Har Sinai. So this is a mitzvah that comes first, that emphasizes the importance of paying attention, of listening to what the Eibusha said at Har Sinai. Is there Saimich din Eved Ivri to Elu mi Sinai? So therefore the place where the Torah puts this is by Sinai, and the Torah does not clearly spell out the history of how this happened, that he first stole and then he didn't have money. That the Torah does not explicitly say. It does put it right near Har Sinai, so you should understand that the reason why it's being said here is because this is a mitzvah that uniquely expresses the fact that a Yid should listen to what the Eibusha said at Har Sinai. Umerames die Sheiches legeneve in dem Prat von Veratza Oznai. The fact that this is related to the person that stole and he didn't pay up is only hinted. It's hinted in the Veratza Oznai that he didn't listen to Loi Signoiv, so you know that this is talking about Geneva. But the Torah doesn't bother telling me the whole history of what was said here. First the Geneva, what should have been said here. First the Geneva, and then he couldn't pay, because that's not the main point. That wouldn't be relevant to say here in this point of history. At this point of history, it's not going to be common for anybody to steal. And even if yes, it would be very uncommon that you shouldn't be able to pay back. The main thing is to bring it right near Har Sinai, because this is a mitzvah that expresses the idea that a Yid has to listen to what the Eibusha said on Har Sinai. So we have our Hezbollah over here, Al Pi Pshuti Shel Mikra, why Rashi goes through the whole discussion over here, B'negea to the meaning of Eved Ivri. The simple pshat of the words Eved Ivri is Eved Ivri. However, looking at this point of history, Rashi has to clarify that perhaps we should say we're talking about an Eved Kanani, because at that point it's not logical to say that any Yidden was sold into slavery at all. And that therefore Rashi has to prove that we in fact are speaking about an Eved Ivri. And there is a unique reason why the Torah brings this here, because this is a mitzvah where we find an einish that expresses the listening to Har Sinai. That's the Hezbollah Al Pi Pshuti Shel Mikra. Now the Rebbe will explain Al Pi Chassidus the reason why Eved Ivri is the first mitzvah, or one of the first mitzvahs right after Matan Torah. Al Pi Bir Anal. There's just one more ice over here where the Rebbe concludes the subject, the Negeit Pshuti Shel Mikra, and then we come to the Pshat Al Pi Chassidus. Al Pi Anal and Pirish Rashi Oiv Ki Sikne. Now, based on what we said before, when Rashi brings the words Ki Sikne, Kum Tzu Nach HaToisvis Hasbar B'zeh. This gives an additional clarification in the fact that the Torah is specifically choosing to speak about an Eved Ivri because this is a follow-up, it's related to Matan Torah. Wenn die Mitzias von Eved Ivri wollt damals bald noch Matan Torah gewend, dava haragel v'hoive, if having a Yid as a slave, being an Eved Ivri, would be something that was common and relevant at that time period. What man gekannt sagen, as das Kuf is the time was der din is angesagt geworden oder Shaina. So that would be the reason why this din was said first, because it's relevant right then. Was is an Inyan, was is Negeya, take a flacha Matan Torah. It is relevant right after Matan Torah. Wie bald aber as Eved Ivri ist damals gewinnt Kanal gar an Inyan von Osid und an a seltenen Fall. This is something which is only for the future and in a seldom situation. It's not common at all. So the Torah can't be saying it here and now for this reason. Is das machriach zu sagen? So this is what forces us to say, as the Tam, was der Din, is angesagt geworden, betchila, The only reason that the Torah is saying the mitzvah of Eved Ivri here and now is mitzad dem inyan miyuchad from Eved Ivri, zayin shayches miyuchedes to Har Sinai. It's only because it has a unique connection to Har Sinai, as the Rabbi explained before, as we see in the Einish of Eratza Doinefes Oznoi, Oizen Zu Sheshama al Har Sinai. So this is an additional clarification that you can see here that this must be connected to Har Sinai. And for no other reason is the Eibush saying it now. So now the Rebbe explains al pi chassidus, v'yomtak al pi pnimi yisan yonim. This is much sweeter and much geschmacker according to chassidus. V'bal, the ganze mechuven von tachlis von Matan Torah is, what's the entire purpose of Matan Torah? Aufzutan durch Torah und mitzvahs den birur v'zichoch in the inyanim von Welt. It's all to elevate and to transform and to refine the world itself. Mashenke, the Torah mitzvahs from the Avis, far Matan Torah, all the Torah mitzvahs that was fulfilled by the Avis even before Matan Torah, it did not bring about a change, it didn't actually transform the physical world itself. That's one of the main accomplishments of Matan Torah. So therefore, is that erste von die Mishpatim lacha Matan Torah. So what's the first of the mitzvahs after Matan Torah? Azat sivi v'din, was it im setzich begolui v'Matan Torah peilt euch in Gashmi Yisraelim. The Torah chooses a mitzvah where we could see the objective of Matan Torah, that it's here to affect and elevate the physical world. We can see it in this mitzvah. Und in dem direkt sich heis, the Dargas HaAveda von an Eved Ivri. This is expressed in the level of the Avedas Hashem that's hinted in an Eved Ivri. The Teres Chassidus is mevayer, as it's explained in my Marim of Chassidus, the Drai Madreges, that when the Torah speaks about the three different individuals, an Eved Kanani, an Eved Ivri, Onama Ivriya, so there's the slave, which is an Eved Kanani, an Eved Ivri, a Yiddish servant, and an Oma Ivriya, a Yiddish maid. In Avedas Hashem, these are actually three different levels in a Yid serving the Eibishter. Benefesh Adam regarding every person. Eved Kanani, the level of an Eved Kanani is there. Was the Nefesh Bahamis is Bayim B'Tokfai. This is an individual that his animal soul is very strong. Avde Be'efkeira Nichale, like a slave that wants to be free and do whatever his heart desires. Und sitzach lamata tzatay v'selam haza. And in his heart, he has a strong Nefesh Bahamis that's drawn into all the lusts of the world. Nor, is kaifa atzmai, und is Oved Hashem b'maisa b'peil mamish b'sur meirav asay toiv, in action. He disciplines himself and does what he's supposed to, mitzad kabbalah soil and amos and because of his fear that he has of his master. Like an Eved Kanani, which is a guy that wants to be free for all, yet he's afraid of punishment, of consequence from his master, so therefore he accepts the yoke of his master and does what he has to. But internally, he's struggling and has a tremendous desire to do otherwise. That's the level of an Eved Kanani. The Aveda von Eved Ivri is, the level of an Eved Ivri is someone in an hechere darge. He's on a higher level. By im then in meyer the midis von nefesh lekis. This is an individual that is ivri, his neshama, his godly soul is shining stronger in nefesh bahamis, and it even affects his nefesh bahamis as well. Bizas oich by the nefesh bahamis is doat shukal Hashem, that he could bring a desire to connect to the Eibishter, that even his animal soul should have such a desire. However, is aber noch nicht nishapach geworden le kedusha. An Eved Ivri is not an individual that has been fully transformed to kedusha. As is on the topic in chemdu to tayvus elam haze, that he should not have any desire for elam haze at all. So this Eved Ivri is a Beinani. He's actually a higher level of a Beinani. I mean, in the Maimarim it explains that even the Eved Kanani is on a level of a Beinani, but that's a much lower level of a Beinani. Someone that the fact that he's fulfilling what he's supposed to is just in the Maisa B'Poel Mamish, but internally his Nefesh Bahamis has not been affected by his Neshama at all, and he has total desire for Elam Haza. And Eved Ivri is on a higher level. His Ivri is more revealed. It does impact his Nefesh Bahamis. However, it's not fully transformed. And therefore he still has desire for Elam Haza. And here the Rebbe points out how you can see this hinted in the difference between an Eved Ivri and Eved Kanani in the simple sense. Al derech wie an Eved was brengt rein in Huis, alle etztarchi is for the bnei bayis von achilu shtia. An Eved Ivri is typically someone that does not such dirty work outside in the field. An Eved Kanani is someone that's a slave working out in the field. He's outdoors. He's there working with the produce and the grain in the field, and he doesn't bring it at all into the home. And that is referring to the Eved Kanani that doesn't even begin at all any process of transformation, of making the food available for the people in the house to consume. He's out in the field. An Eved Ivri, however, refers to a person that does cleaner work. He brings the food into the house for the people to eat. However, in the case of the Eved Ivri, yes, he brings the food into the house, but it's not yet prepared in the kitchen, cooked, baked for a person to eat. His work does not entail preparing the food and making it available for human consumption. So he is the beginning of the process of bringing what's inside into the house, which hints to the fact that he's an individual that his nefesh alekis is affecting his nefesh bahamis. However, it's not yet the full transformation. The avodah of the maidservant, which is in the kitchen and preparing the food, and now it's available for human consumption, is was die taivis umidis von nefesh bahamis werden es hapach lekedusha. This hints to an individual that has fully and totally transformed the lusts of his nefesh bahamis, completely turned over to holiness. Biz ein shuke is nar zu elokos. This is a tzaddik or a tzaddik gomor, which is on a level that has been totally transformed to godliness. That's the Amma Ivriya. So now we can understand why the Eved Ivri is unique. Und damit is move on. So based on this we can understand was die Aschale von the Mishpatim lacha Matan Torah, the beginning of the Mishpatim after Matan Torah, was das bringt der Reis, die Peule von Matan Torah in Welt. It's coming to express the effect that Matan Torah has on transforming the world is mit die Dinim von Eved Ivri. We begin, the first step, the first stage of this Aveda of transformation starts with an Eved Ivri. Valdas, Eved Ivri is the Ascholas HaAveda von a Yid lacha Matan Torah, because the Eved Ivri represents the beginning of a Yid's Aveda after Matan Torah, which is Poil Zayin. Auf den Nefesh Bahamis und in Yonei Ha'olam Bechlal, as soll nestane werden und reinkommen in Reshus HaKedusha, beginning the process of your neshama affecting your Nefesh Bahamis and the world in general to elevate them and bring them into the domain of holiness. That's the Nefesh. That's the Eved Ivri, the beginning of the process. Mashenkin, the Aveda von Eved Kanani. On the other hand, the Aveda of an Eved Kanani is noch netok in Shini Amiti in seine Middes v'avalderech ze bechelke ba'olam. He is an individual that's not yet causing any transformation. His Aveda is outdoors. He's in actuality, in practical life, doing what he's supposed to, but there's no transformation in the taivus of his Nefesh Bahamis taking place yet. So the Eved Kanani is sort of a pre-Matan Torah kind of Aveda. It's the Eved Ivri which expresses the beginning of the process where a person starts to make a transformation in his Nefesh Bahamis. So that's the beginning. That's the first mitzvah that comes right after Matan Torah. And then following this, comes the next mitzvah in the parsha, the Hemshech HaAveda, which is letting us know what the next step in a person's Aveda is. The Aveda von Amma Ivriya, you come to be a maid servant, as man is mahapech, the midis for Nefesh Bahamis, when one could totally transform the midis of his Nefesh Bahamis, und in Yonei Ha'olam Bechlal, and matters in the world in general, azei zolem werden adira loy isbarach, that everything in the world should become a dwelling for the Eibishter in the world.